I've been experiencing some weird things in my house for years now. I think it started back in 2011. Let me explain. I came back from school with my siblings and my mother. I was 12, I think. We arrived at home and I took off my shoes and ran upstairs. I peeked inside my sister's room as I was walking towards my room, and that's when I realized something was wrong. It was all messy and everything was out of their place. I told my mom as I feared somebody had broken in, but we checked all the doors and the windows and they were locked. Now you can imagine my surprise when I saw that my room was also messy. My clothes and my mattress were on the floor and everything just seemed wrong, as if somebody had done it out of hate. We all got the creeps when we saw my sister's stuffed animals. They were scratched, torn apart, like if some sort of animal had gotten inside my house. But as I said, every possible entrance was locked. We never knew what happened that day. Things were normal for years after that occurrence, but then in 2014, I think, some really creepy stuff started to happen. One day I was alone in my house. It was a school day, but I had faked a stomach ache, so I stayed home. I have a TV in my room, so I just left my room to get some food or go to the bathroom. I was minding my own business watching something on Netflix, when suddenly I saw a human-shaped figure walking past my room. It was tall and thin, and it took the shadow a few seconds to escape my eyesight, but it felt like an eternity. It went into my sister's room, and I think it was walking out of my mom's room. Now, as you can imagine, I was freaked out. I locked my door and tried to get my mind off of it, and told no one about this at first. This is where the story gets even more scarier. My room is very big, because I share it with my brother. And one night, my sister came to her room and asked if she could sleep in the small couch we have in our room. I didn't answer, as it was really late and I just wanted to go back to sleep. But my brother did, as they are very close. We all went to sleep, and the next day, she told us she was scared but didn't tell us why. That of course made me nervous, because my sister is really mature, and it was very rare to see her scared. We went on with our day, and when the night came, me and my brother heard my sister arguing with my mom. We went in and started to hear the conversation. My sister was crying and seemed very scared and mad. I remember she said that my mom was trying to creep her out, and she ran to her room. We asked my mom what was wrong with my sister, and she told us why my sister was so scared. She said as she was falling asleep, she felt as if somebody was sitting on her bed, and then she saw a shadow standing close to her bed. Obviously, I was creeped out. My mom had also told us she had seen the shadow walking by, but that she wasn't scared of it. My brother told me that one night he was trying to fall asleep after being on the phone for hours. I was already asleep by then, but he recalls hearing a faint whistling sound that immediately caught his attention. The whistling was coming from my bed. He said it was very clear and loud, and that's what freaked him out. So imagine that something was next to me whistling while I was asleep. I forget to mention that my doorbell would ring every day at 3. It all started when one day we were all eating in my kitchen, and somebody rang our doorbell. One of us got to the door just to realize nobody was there. We didn't really care because we thought it was a kid pulling a prank on us. But the next day, it rang again, and nobody was there. And that, of course, kept happening. Sometimes it was at 3 o'clock exactly. Sometimes it was at 3:01 or 3:02. One day, my mom was outside my house, and at 3 o'clock, she was back from the store or something. When she was about to walk towards the door, she swears she saw as if somebody was pressing the doorbell button. We disconnected our doorbell after that. Finally, one day I was alone in my room. I was using my iPod while it was charging. I was minding my own business when suddenly my iPod decided to throw itself to the ground. It felt as if somebody had pushed it very hard and out of my hand. The push was so hard that it disconnected the charger and dropped my iPod so hard that the screen shattered completely. Whatever's living in my house really hates us. Those were some of the strange things that have happened in my house. Not all of them.
This just happened about 2 hours ago, and I'm still shaking. I live on the coast of SC, and my backyard is directly on the marshland. So I woke up and went downstairs to use the bathroom. I kept having this weird nagging feeling like I was forgetting something or that something was off, so I went to find my mother. She's a night owl and she stays up super late doing gardening and stuff like that. She even likes to feed the raccoons. So I went to my backyard, and I then see her standing there about 100 feet from the back door facing the marshland. I called out for her, but she didn't hear me, so I just started walking out towards her. Once I started getting closer, she turned to face me with a completely blank expression. I asked her what was wrong. I was about 12 feet away from her, and she turned back towards the marshland again. Then, the back door swings open, and I turn to see my mother standing on the deck, and she's calling out to ask me what I'm doing. I've never ran so fast in my life, but as I looked back to the marsh, I could just see that thing disappearing, whatever it was. It looked just like my mum did. I yelled at my mum to go inside and that there was something out there. I told her exactly what I'd seen, and I started shaking and crying. We woke up my husband and dad, and they think I must have just been in a sleep state or that I dreamed it, but I can't stop shaking. The craziest thing is that I could see footprints from where she was standing. I know I didn't just see this in my head. I know I'm not losing my mind.
Hello everybody. I wanted to share details of regular unexplained and paranormal activity that has been occurring at our family home for nearly 30 years. The activity ranges from cold spots and noises to moving shadows and full-on apparitions. In turn, each family member has heard or witnessed something, but some more than others. I'm interested to read what people's thoughts are on the matter, and if anybody else has experienced such things, you should write them down. I grew up in Salford, near Manchester in the UK, and we moved into what is a 2-up, 2-down council house in and around 1990 or 1991. During that period of time, it was myself, my parents, and my younger brother. I'm not sure when the activity first started precisely, but I'm aware that it is within a couple years of us moving in. My brother from an early age complained of being disturbed at night by an old man, and on several occasions would wake up and inform my grandmother, who would babysit of an evening whilst my parents were out. He would say that the man had told him to wake up for school. As far as I knew, this was chalked up to bad dreams, or a vivid imagination. However, the instances of my brother seeing this old man became more frequent and started to occur during the daytime. My mom recalls a particular day when my brother dashed downstairs, visibly upset, telling her that the man was following him and was walking down the stairs. She checked the staircase, but nobody was there. It was around this time that she had her initial encounter with the old man. When vacuuming the living room, she describes seeing a pair of legs in pressed, pinstripe trousers and a knitted tank top on the torso. She says that from the bottom, the apparition was almost like a living person, which stood in the room, but then it started to fade towards the top of the body, with the head of course and the face barely visible. She remembers throwing the vacuum in the direction of the figure and running through to the back of the house and outside. A few days later, she told her neighbor about what she had seen. The neighbor, of course, as you might imagine, was a little bit disturbed, and told her that who she was describing was the previous occupier, an elderly man by the name Fred. He had passed away in the house, and it was a couple of years after his wife. Fred was seen on several occasions shortly after, again by my mom and brother, but also my grandmother. My grandmother told me years later of her experience, that she was helping my mom do some work in our garden when she saw an elderly man walk out of our back door and across the garden, vanishing as he walked. She told my mom of what she had seen, who in turn told her about the elderly man who seemed to be haunting the house. Although he didn't seem threatening, it really unsettled my grandmother, and coupled with my brother's encounters, she refused to take care of us at the house, and instead we spent a lot of time at hers. To this day, she isn't particularly fond of visiting my parents' home. From then on out, sounds of walking around in the bedrooms or on the stairs upstairs when nobody was in or out of them ended up increasing, and items disappearing or being moved around became a part of the norm, particularly for my mom. We did notice that the activity was more persistent around summertime. My mom was, and still is, the person who witnessed the most activity out of all of us. Whether this was because she was in the house more, or she is particularly sensitive, I'm not sure. But I believe a lot of the activity can be explained logically. What is interesting, however, is that when our parents decided to move my brother and I into different rooms, my brother seemingly stopped being disturbed by Fred, but my mom experienced more. I personally didn't experience anything until I was 14 or 15 years old, when in the early hours of the morning, I heard continuous, almost deliberate footsteps around the stairs and landing area. I remember waking up, quite annoyed of course, believing it to be my dad having a relentless night. And of course, as you'd imagine, all I wanted was enough sleep for school the next day. I called out to him to shut up and go to bed. That's when the noise suddenly stopped. No noise of feet returning to the bedroom or going downstairs. Just complete silence. Around a minute or two later, my bedroom door flung open and hit the wall. I remember jolting up and seeing nothing in the doorway, but the sound of footsteps started moving around my room. I yelled out to my parents and dived under the covers. My dad rushed down the landing and the footsteps stopped just as he came into the room. I told him what had happened and that I was frightened. He didn't laugh it off or tell me it was nothing to worry about, but instead told me to get into the bed with my mom and that he would stay in my room for the rest of the night. I found out a few years later that this was a regular occurrence for my parents, constantly being woken up by footsteps on the landing and stairs as well as around the perimeter of their bed. My parents seemed unnerved that something had started to disturb another one of their children. I'm aware that this post is becoming very lengthy, but there's so much more to tell you guys, especially as we now have a younger sister who is having her own unusual experiences. I live in my own home with my little family, and it seems to be spirit-free. But even to this day, I find I'm having conversations with my parents about the unusual activity happening in their home. The most concerning so far has been of a dark figure sitting cross-legged in the corner of my brother's room around 4 or 5 years ago. He says that he felt like it watched him for an extended length of time, and that when he tried to ignore it, he could feel and hear tapping on the headboard of his bed. Eventually, it ended up being too much for him, and he vaulted out of bed, past the figure that was sitting in the corner, and out of the room and vomited in the bathroom with fright. However, as a true show of masculinity and the obvious need to get some sleep for an early start, he went back to bed, enduring the tappings again and told whatever to go to hell, because he had work in the morning. For the past few years, my 11-year-old sister has experienced a lot of knocking noise around her headboard, similar to the ones my brother experienced the night he saw the dark figure. It's important to point out that these are occurring in different rooms and on different types of headboards. My brother's are leather and wood. My sister's are iron frame. Since a youngster, she has preferred to stay in my parents' room, but from the age of 7 or 8 years old, they knew they needed to get her out of the habit. Nowadays, my sister has it initially okay with going to bed in her room, but she gets disturbed around the same time every other night by knocking sounds on her bed and finds her way back to my parents' bedroom. As far as I'm aware, she hasn't seen anything unusual, but she definitely isn't keen on being alone in her room for long periods of time and has complained to me in the private that she thinks somebody watches her. My parents are reluctant to talk to her about what might be happening and the family's past experiences as my sister gets easily spooked. They have asked myself and my brother not to elaborate on what she may be experiencing. My belief is that it could be attributed to the telekinesis theory of young children, especially those nearing or going through puberty, which can make things happen around them without realizing. But my mom is on the firm understanding that my sister may be encountering a spirit. My mom has recalled the following story a couple of times to me. I'm not sure I believe it to what she thinks it is, but I find it fascinating nonetheless. On the night my grandfather was dying, a little over 10 years ago, my dad had been told to come to the hospital with his siblings. My mom was heavily pregnant at the time and chose to stay at home and await the news. She remembers sitting in the living room watching TV when she could hear knocking on the front window and on the front door. It is a knock that members of our family do when visiting our house. My mom assumed a relative had come over regarding my granddad and looked out of the window to see who it was. The only thing is, nobody was there. She thought it unusual, but brushed it off and went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. Again, the noise of tapping on the window and the front door happened again. But as she was about to see what it was, the noise of running came from across the landing and down the stairs, stopping at the front door. Thinking it was my brother and something was wrong, she went to go investigate. Nothing, though. She said she had the most uneasiest feeling at this point, and something just felt very off. Shortly after, my mom received a call from my dad, informing her that my grandfather had passed away. That's when she realized the knocking had happened around the same time he passed away. To this day, my mom believes that my grandfather may have been trying to visit his son, and Fred wasn't happy about another spirit entering the home. I think it's possible that with my grandfather's death imminent, tension and emotion would have been high, and that could be a psychological thing on my mom's part. That said, I don't think she has made it up. It genuinely unnerves her even now, but it may have been her mind playing tricks rather than paranormal. However, this is one of my favorite stories of unusual activity at our home, and it does make others feel uneasy when I tell them.
I first heard this story when I was in college. I'd come home from winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunters program on TV, just for the laughs. I really don't believe any of that. Now when you watch your programs on TV like that, it's so obvious that they're fake. It's too hard for me to let them go into my head and believe them. I mean really, I just can't get into it. Now my dad was the same way, so I thought. He seemed interested in the paranormal, but only very slightly. He was the kind of guy who would often scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial, and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" "Yup." His reply actually shocked me. "Really?" I was a bit taken back. "Like, it just doesn't seem like you," I said to him. He shrugged his shoulders and mulled over at what I just said. "Yeah," he replied, eventually. "But I know ghosts are real. I met one." Upon hearing this statement, I had to know the full story. You see, my dad is like me. He likes to tell the stories. I could retell most of the stories from memory that he's told me, but just because he would tell me them so frequently, to anybody who would listen, here's my dad's story that I'd never actually heard, and it's an event that actually changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't know if I believe it or not, but when somebody is so influential in your life and tries telling you this, and they're so down to earth, you kind of have to believe it. Now though he never brings it up when I talk to him about it, I swear it's completely true. There is no exaggeration, and I have no doubt in my mind about what happened. So here is the story in my dad's words. It was back in the house in Tacoma, where you grew up until you were about 4. My parents still lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for the weekend. I was just over at the Tacoma Community College, so it wasn't that far away. I came back often to visit and get a home-cooked meal. I remembered that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just 3 of us. It was in late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't really gotten dark out yet. We were talking like normal, when the phone suddenly rang. It was in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and me in the room together alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. "Leo, can you come here for a moment?" I remembered she seemed worried, like her voice was shaken. My dad wiped his face, got up and joined my mum in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were quietly talking, and it felt strange. After a few moments they come out of the kitchen. They had their coats on now. "Something's up, and we have to go out for a bit," my mum said. "There's dessert in the fridge, you just help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes. We'll do them when we get back." So my dad said nothing, but I could tell from the look on his face that it was serious. My mum looked genuinely worried. They were out of the door in a flash, and I left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table and washed my plate, despite my mother's instructions. Then I went to the main room to read. I sat down on the sofa, opened one of my school books and began to relax. Hours went by, and my parents still hadn't come back yet, and it was around 11 o'clock. My parents still hadn't come back, so I went to get ready for bed. I walked up the stairs, making my way to the bathroom. I suddenly heard the strangest sound. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out whining noise. The wood was genuinely creaking. It wasn't an unusual sound. There was some unusual rhythm that made me feel uncomfortable and curious. After listening for a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, along with a metallic creaking sound. I gathered up my courage and decided to investigate. Now I have to say, I wasn't scared. I did have an uneasy feeling. To be honest, after a few seconds though, I felt quite comfortable, even though it was very dark and eerie. The energy in the floor wasn't foreboding. It almost felt warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it soon became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage items was an old rocking chair, one that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of the many possessions she had left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly, and couldn't fit much of her belongings into the room. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboard to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, there was also an old bird cage. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet metallic creak. I figured that it was just a draft, and knowing that the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it, I went out and wanted to find the source. I compared the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside. It was a calm evening. Furthermore, the chair was heavy as the birdcage was, yet there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed. There were stacks of paper and stuff like that. It really wasn't making much sense to me. After a while, I decided to give up and looked back at the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my arm on the armrest, and it suddenly stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any kind of draft. I lifted my hand and the chair was calm and quiet, but as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back and the chair was still rocking. It was really strange, but as I said before, it wasn't really creeping me out much. I just shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was still slowly swinging open and closed. The cage once housed a parrot that belonged to my grandmother, but it had been empty for a long time now. I figured that if I at least shut this, then I could stop one of the sounds. So I did that. I then started heading towards the steps. As I was about halfway down, I heard that same metallic creaking sound again. I looked behind me and the door was back open, swinging once again unlatched, right alongside the chair, which continued rocking like before. Something had unlatched it. I sure hadn't done it myself. Now in any other circumstance, I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason, I wasn't. I just didn't feel easy. Now a rocking chair and a birdcage aren't really the most scary things anyway. I just ascended the attic with a last glance at the strange behaviour. I then went about my bedtime routine. The creaking sound continued for a while and I couldn't sleep for it. I went back downstairs to where I could hear the noise, and I continued reading. It was a little after midnight when my parents pulled into the driveway. They came in and found me reading, and they sat down with me. My mum was crying. They explained to me that they had spent the night at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away.
So a little bit of background story. I decided to ride my bike to and from work during the summer to save up a little more money to buy a nicer car. I was living in California's Central Valley, so it was hot during the day and warm at night, so not really a big deal. I rode my bike for roughly 3 months, 5 to 6 days a week, back and forth on the same path that led almost directly from my work and right to my house. One night we were getting out of work particularly late. I worked at a restaurant, and getting out at 1 in the morning on the weekends wasn't unheard of. My coworker, who usually rode with me on days we worked together, had gotten a ride from his girlfriend, so I was alone. Usually where I live, the summer nights are warm with a light breeze, and I actually love riding at night. There was no traffic, no families on bikes clogging both lanes, and all that kind of stuff. I pretty much always got back within 20 minutes of leaving, max 30 if I was really going slow. And this night was different though. From the get-go, as soon as I walked out the door, it was really cold, which is unheard of. So I decided to just ride fast and get home quick. It actually starts off pretty normal. I'm going over a bridge that goes over a freeway, and then it makes a weird turn. The street lamps behind me start to make a loud electrical noise, so I look back. It's as if something was approaching the lights behind me, and they start to flicker one by one. I'm a little spooked out at this point, but then I hear what sounds like another biker coming along the path behind me, and I feel relief that there's another person nearby me. Then the noise changes. It turns into a whistling, howling noise that rushes by me, actually flapping my shirt. Now, I'm on borderline freaking out at this point, so I ride even faster. I keep hearing sounds like whispering behind me, and multiple times I feel like something would snag the back of my shirt, or even the pants on my leg. Keep in mind, this bike path looks nearly identical from start to finish. It's just a path of dead grass on both sides and walls with houses. Very easy to lose track of where you are. So I keep riding and riding faster, and my heart is going faster than ever before. I'm on a fixed gear truck bike, so I can get it moving pretty quick when I want to. So I'm tearing down this path, and I never see a single sign of life the whole way down. No cars crossing at intersections, no people on back porches, just the path lights flickering behind me, and noises that sound almost human right behind me the whole time. I finally make it onto the road I turn on to get to my house. It's dead empty. There are 0 cars, and even in my semi-small town, this is unheard of. There's always cars stuck at a light or even at 7-Eleven on the corner, but there's no one anywhere. So I kept going, the light-sounding noises still behind me. I get right in front of my door and unlock it, and take my bike straight up to the door. I wasn't going to mess around and open the garage. I go up the stairs, and that's when the most terrifying part happened. I looked at the clock. It said it was 3:12 a.m. Now, it had taken me almost 2 hours to get home, and I still have no idea how it took me so long. I have no resolution for the noises, or even the flickering lights or the complete absence of people. But needless to say, I never took that bike path again.
I've been a police officer in Mineral Wells, Texas for about 5 years now. If you're wondering, Mineral Wells is about 50 miles west of Fort Worth and has a population of about 16,000. The people here are salt of earth type people, God-fearing, hard-working kind, but something has always been a little off about them, almost like they're carrying a secret that nobody's supposed to know. Mineral Wells become a ghost town after about 7 PM. That's at all of the drive-in stops, and it's really eerie, to be honest. It's very safe for my patrol car though. Now, in the 5 years that I've been there, I've never seen anything or heard anything strange. I don't believe any of the things I hear most of the time. If I hadn't had my own strange experience when I was a child, I'd probably be thinking I was crazy, but I'm not. The thing is that sometimes things happen that are truly unexplainable. They are real. I'd like to relay one of those experiences to you. Perhaps I can tell you. I have a ton. Now, to understand Mineral Wells, you have to know about its history. I learnt most of this when I visited the Historical Society after about 6 months of moving there. Apparently, it was founded in 1881 by a guy named J.A. Lynch. After Lynch dug up the first drinkable water, he claimed that there was something strange about the water though. Apparently, it was able to cure some of his wife's illnesses. It was almost like miracle water. Very soon after, word got out about this miracle water. Quickly, a second well was discovered, then a third. A woman decided to drink from the third well to try and cure her dementia. Guess what? She was miraculously cured. The local children started calling the third well the crazy water well, and they started just calling it the crazy water. It was strange how this miracle water flowed from the earth. News about this crazy water spread far and wide, and by the early 1900s, Miracle Wells had become the South's greatest health resort, with hundreds of mineral wells, bathhouses, bars, hotels, etc. People travelled all from over the country in hopes of experiencing this amazing healing power. As you probably imagine, many of the visitors were old or dying. Today, Mineral Wells is a shadow of its former self. Whilst it still has industry, it mostly operates as a tourism and retirement community. But don't let that fool you. In this town, there's a famous quote that says, "The past is never dead. It's not even the past." Now, after I'd been on the falls for about a month, I had my first experience of strangeness of Mineral Wells. We got in a frantic 911 call about somebody finding a dead body. I still remember the address. It was at Baker Hotel. I was working nights there. Apparently, that's where the rookies start, and the call come in at about 12:30 AM. My partner and I were in the area, and it didn't take us long to get there. When we arrived, the 911 caller was gone, but the body was there, just as I had described it. It turned out to be a young woman. She was splayed out on the red brick steps that led up to the front entrance. Her back was broken and whatnot. It was honestly the first time that I'd ever seen anything like this. She had fallen from a great height. I remembered looking up to see if there were any balconies that she could have come from, but there weren't any. But there were plenty of windows since it was an old hotel. They didn't have very good safety features like modern hotels do. In fact, many of the windows were left open. I later learnt that the Baker Hotel had been shut down in the 70s, but no one would ever admit as to why. We secured the team and called out an investigation unit. The girl turned out to be a 29-year-old. She had been a resident of Mineral Wells her entire life and worked as a manager at a local cafe. On the night in question, Paulina had been out with some of her friends and was at a bar near the hotel. One of the girls that she had been out with had told the investigators that they had all been hanging out on the 7th floor of the hotel drinking after the bars closed. They suddenly realised that they couldn't find their friend anywhere. They began looking for her and found her clothes in a pile of one of the rooms next to an open window. When they realised that she had fallen, they called 911. There were only two bits of information they could offer. That the first was that she was called Paulina, and she had been overheard saying that she needed to go and meet Virginia. But none of them knew who her friend was. The second was that there were rumours in the town that she had been having an affair with the owner of the cafe she worked at, but none of them admitted ever seeing him with her. When I first heard all of this, it seriously disturbed me. By all accounts, she was a young, well-adjusted woman who had no reason to kill herself. Why would she do it? And why did she take off all of her clothes before doing so? After a full investigation, I didn't hear much about the case again. The investigators thought the circumstances were odd, but odd things happened in Mineral Wells all the time, and they were just pressing cases. This case was eventually closed. I didn't hear anything about it until about 5 months later, as I was poring over manuscripts at the Historical Society's archives. Then I came across a passage that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Here's what it had said. One story involving the Baker Hotel revolves around a woman known as Virginia Brown. As a resident of the hotel who was the alleged mistress of T.V. Baker, the owner and builder of the hotel, according to legend, Virginia was upset over the affair and drunkenly plunged to her death after jumping from the 13th floor. Many visitors to the hotel before it closed in 1972 have reported seeing a dead woman, sometimes wearing a red dress and sometimes not wearing anything at all. She roams the halls after midnight. This freaked me out, and I was about to note right out of there, but I've suddenly realised there was a reference to another document. It turned out to be the hotel's ledger from the mid-1900s. I searched for Virginia Brown's name and found it. She'd become a resident at the time, and there was a notation under the room heading, Room 714. It was at this moment that I realised that there was something seriously wrong and strange about Mineral Wells.
I've got a story that I rarely tell, because it always freaks me out. At the time I was 18, just graduated high school. I didn't go to college right away. I actually took a break and picked up a second job instead. For my second job, I worked a third shift, 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., with 4 other people on a rotated schedule. No more than 3 a night, sometimes 2. After a few months, I became friends with my coworkers. We'd take smoke breaks and eat lunch in the back, play music, etc. Honestly, it was a chill job and I actually liked it. Working at night can mess with your brain though. I realized that. However, my body had completely adjusted and I was always energetic and ready to get the shift done. At this point, I should probably say that when we worked, all the doors were locked and there was absolutely no way to go in or out without triggering the nightly alarm that automatically sets. One night when we showed up, before our manager left for the night and locked up, He told us it would only be my co-worker, I'll use the name Mike, and I, as our scheduled third, we'll call him Jake, called in sick about an hour ago. Me and Mike had no problem. I was probably closest to him because he was my age, and I had my dad as a teacher at his school. We start our usual routine with walking around the store with my manager to ensure nobody is there. Then we check the alarm and watch him lock the doors on his way out. We decided the first order of business was to smoke a cigarette in the back of the warehouse. The smoke detector was a good ways up, and we never had an issue with setting it off. Now, here's where it gets wild, so stay with me. Me and Mike pulled the pallet stacked with boxes out from the warehouse and onto the main floor. I grabbed a dolly with some boxes of dried goods and headed to a different aisle so we could be ahead of schedule. We always typically split up for efficiency. About 15 minutes pass and I head back for more boxes. The pallet was in the central point in between us. Neither of us were in the same aisle as it. When I got there, I saw a bag of chips and dip opened on the pallet, with obvious dip marks in the dip. Now, we often ate food and left cash at the customer service desk. Our manager was okay with it. Mike met me at the pallet as I was loading up my second trip. I jokingly made fun of him for getting chips and dip because it seemed like an odd snack during work. He looked me dead in the eye, and I saw his face visibly change and say, "Oh man, that's yours." Apparently, my face did the same when I told him it wasn't. Obviously, Jake was there pulling a prank on us or something, and the manager went along with it, right? Well, no. At this point, we decided to be logical and check the store to catch whoever is doing this. We both have goosebumps the size of mosquito bites on our arms as we try to laugh it off. But something just felt off. Way off. It just seemed a little colder and we were both on edge. We sweep the warehouse in the back and the break room and we don't find anything. No dice. As we get to the front of the store, there's only one entrance to the store. It's right near all the 12 registers we had. In the front, there's big metal racks where we sold charcoal for grilling, and also those big logs that burn really slow so people that can't survive on their own can escape the city and enjoy campfires. As we walk inside of it, we hear a whoosh and 3 logs flew off the shelf. Now I'm not gonna lie to you here. I screamed and Mike jumped. We were freaking out at this point, but I stopped and convinced him to walk to the shelf with me, about 15 feet away, so we could check and make sure the shelf was sturdy. With 2 adults, over 170 each, we couldn't budge. Something threw the logs off in front of our face. And as we walk around the store again, trying to find somebody, we don't find anybody. We decided the best thing to do was to continue to work and listen to loud music. We ended up working together the rest of the night. Now, here's the craziest part. We got done a little early, so at 4:50, 10 minutes before day shift came in to relieve us, we started goofing off on those electric scooters for the handicap that were parked in the front. It's critical that I tell you the front had big glass windows, so you could see both in and out from the parking lot. We kinda just didn't talk about what we saw after it happened. I went to sleep that day and woke up to a call from Jake. He sounded like he was having a panic attack. His mom, who worked there during the day, was one of the ones that came in at 5. She was older. Working there was more of a way to keep busy than out of necessity, I think. Jake told me on the phone that when I left, his mom started talking to him in the office, where we clocked in and out. She asked him, "Who is by the door in all black watching you guys on the scooter?" Needless to say, I couldn't sleep. Mike and I never worked alone after that. Later on, I found out that his family had a history of weird experiences like this. Whatever happened that night scared the hell out of me. It wasn't after me, but to this day, I still get spooked.
I live deep in the Alaskan bush. I grew up there. For those of you who don't know what the bush is, it's basically where the mountain men are. They're all extremely self-sufficient. Anyway, I was born and raised on my grandpa's homestead. They migrated from Norway and somehow got the idea to live there. Some things about my grandparents. They're both very much of the old ways. They believe in the spirits. Also, they're very used to living off the land. Now, when my grandparents moved to their homestead, they made friends with our closest neighbours who are a few hours away. They are a tribe of Native Americans who refer to themselves as the Dene. I think my grandparents got on well with them because they had similar beliefs. Anyway, I remembered waking up in the middle of the night out of a heavy sleep, not groggy at all, like I'd just been awake for hours. Normally I'd go back to bed, but for some reason I felt the need to get a drink of water. I wasn't even thirsty, I just felt the need to get a drink. I remembered opening the fridge, grabbing the jug of water and pouring myself a glass. I don't know how to explain this part. I tried to put it into words for 15 years. I felt a compulsion to look to my right and just out of the kitchen window. I wasn't forced or anything, it was just a nagging feeling. That's when I saw it. It literally gives me nightmares to this day. I thought it was an animal at first, unlike anything I'd seen before staring directly at me. It had the antlers of an elk, but its face was messed up. It was almost demonic looking. Its eyes given away that it wasn't normal. It had forward-facing eyes, almost like a predator. It was very dark and I could barely see, but it had milky white teeth. Its mouth was in fact moving, but I couldn't hear what it was saying. It just stared at me. I wasn't afraid. It just felt like the sense left my body. I stared back for about 20 seconds, turned round and went to bed. I was just confused out of my mind. I was sure that I was sleeping this. I knew it wasn't anybody messing with me because how far the house is away, or if they were, it was very strange. The next morning I heard my father cussing and yelling, telling my uncles to grab their rifles and hunting gear. We had this big insulated chicken coop that could pass as a barn anywhere else, that we chained up every night so wolves or bears wouldn't get in. Well, something smashed into that coop and killed all the chickens. It's never happened before and never since. I remembered that as all of this was going on, I saw some of the tribe men talking to my grandfather. No big deal. They stopped by every once a week to check up basically. My dad is still shouting and annoyed. I think it was an animal that I saw last night. My dad starts asking me for the details when I explain what I saw, and my grandfather and the Native American men immediately stopped talking. They came over and asked me to be very specific. I was sure I was dreaming about it being 9 yards tall. They then started talking amongst themselves and to my grandfather for a bit and said they'd be back ASAP. When asking what the hell was going on, we were told that we were visited by a paranormal spirit and that it was very dangerous, and out of respect that they would not talk into any more detail about what had happened. We were told never to talk about it, since speaking of it gives it power. None of us had this, but I had to get it off of my chest. I now live in the southwest US now, but to this day, I will not go into the forest alone or for extended periods of time. I was almost certain that what I saw was just in my sleep and not real, but thinking of it, who knows what could be out there in the wilderness like that, miles away from people and civilization. For some brief context, I'm a 22-year-old female, and the following events occurred when I was 19 to 21. When I moved away for college, I started talking to the Catholic priest, Father Gabe, who ran the chapel and women's shelter behind my dorm building because something scary happened to me, and I really didn't know who else to talk to. Plus, he was literally like 100 feet from my bedroom window. Anyway, long story short, Father Gabe is the exorcist for the vast surrounding areas. He's also a demonologist and he was born and raised in Rome. He studied there. He's also super old, like 87, and he's super broad-minded as well considering that he's a priest. I feel the need to specify that I'm not an overly religious person. I'm more spiritual, and my basic belief system is that there's something greater than us that our minds just can't simply comprehend, and that this entity we label as God, well, that's there and it does exist. There are things that are beyond our control that are sometimes malevolent. Now, demons isn't really the right term for them. It's the only term that we've come up with, but they are very evil. So basically, I think that every religion in the world has a piece to the puzzle, but none of them paint the whole picture. Last, it's important to explain the reason I began working with Father Gabe on his cases. For the sake of space, I'm going to be very clear. I have a sixth sense and my connection to the other side has always been very strong ever since I was a small child. It runs in my family on both sides, so I guess you could say I was kind of physically born into this, for better or worse. I told Father Gabe about this, and after testing me numerous times, he asked me to help him with an extremely violent case. I agreed, and without much hesitation, that's where my story begins. The victim of this was a 7-year-old boy. For his own privacy, I'll just call him Danny. Danny's been acting very strange for the past few months. His parents had taken him to numerous doctors, psychologists, specialists, etc., but they were never able to diagnose anything wrong with him. His mum, Sarah, was a nurse and the family wasn't particularly religious, but Sarah's parents were convinced that they had to take Danny to the Baptist church and they needed to see the pastor. Though the pastor knew that something was horribly wrong with this kid, but he didn't have the necessary skills or knowledge to help him. That's when Father Gabe got called. Now the memories are kind of fuzzy. It's been a few years, so I really can't remember Danny's whole story, like when the weirdness started and how things escalated to the point that they did. But I do remember listening to an audio recording of Father Gabe's first interview with this kid, and there were multiple voices talking with some different languages. Just unnatural weird stuff. Anyway, I'll skip to the investigation proportion of this story, although a lot of crazy stuff happened then. It wasn't like the actual exorcisms. It's just weird. Now I'm going to go into detail with the most intense, terrifying parts and gloss over everything else. So the first exorcism attempt. Danny is strapped down to his bed with hospital restraints and hooked up to an IV because he stopped eating and drinking. Sarah, being a nurse, was able to get these things fairly easily, so I went there thinking, oh that's alright, we won't have to hold him down like in those crazy movies. But I was so very wrong. Real quick, the way a Catholic priest's exorcism goes is sort of like a mass. Basically, there's a part where the priest says that they're gonna do a part called the congregation. It's mostly just echoing whatever the priest says, and Father Gabe performed his in Latin. It can be done in English though. So Father Gabe starts reading from his Roman rites book, and the younger assistant priest, Rendell, as well as myself, were all reading along with him. Not even a page in, the kid starts struggling violently against his restraints, and when he realizes that his wrists and ankles are strapped down, his spine bends backwards to the most unnatural arch that I've ever seen before. His face was almost against his stomach. He bites the IV connected to his arm and tries to rip through it with his teeth. I'm not lying, blood splattered everywhere and was spraying from the bottle like in a horror movie. I then had to drop my book to go and help Father Randall. That's Roy, Danny's dad, and Hurdle, Sarah's dad and Danny's grandpa, hold Danny down while his mum was bandaging him up. Skip forward to the fourth attempt. We're all worn out. Danny obviously the most, but we have to power through. So we start the exorcism and things start going crazy. The power goes out and one by one the candles in the room are blown out. Now I'm afraid of the dark, so the moment this happens I'm already on my knees trying to find my flashlight, desperately searching. I do find it quick though, but by then the room is pitch black and strangely silent. My hands are shaking as I fumble around trying to turn on the flashlight when suddenly I smell rancid meat and a deep, guttury voice asks me in a mocking tone, "Are you afraid, Noel?" Directly into my ear from just over my shoulder. This made me instantly leap up and let out a really loud scream. I was terrified, dropping the flashlight to the ground in the process. When it hits the ground, it turns on and the beam of light darts around the room, bouncing off everything, briefly illuminating Danny. He's now standing in the centre of the bed staring directly at me. He has the most disturbing smile that I've ever seen. This instantly made me fall down to my knees, and I start blindly feeling around for my flashlight that I can no longer see since it went out as soon as it flicked on. I find it soon though and flick it on to see that Danny's no longer standing on the bed like he was less than a second ago. I shine the light around and much to everyone's shock and horror, we find him crammed into the 1.5 foot wide gap between the top of his bookshelf and the ceiling. His body is contorted and he's crying, confused as to why he's up there, and obviously he's in a lot of pain. All the men help to get him down, and just like that, the power come back on. Now skip ahead again to the 7th attempt. I'm not even sure if this kid is going to survive this alone, and he's just getting more and more terrified, and it's leaving me emotionally rattled. We're halfway through the exorcism. I see that the main entity that's been inhibiting Danny's body suddenly appears. It's squatting on top of Danny's chest, staring down at him, laughing. Its skin is inky black, so that way it absorbs all of the light that hits it instead of reflecting it. Everything about its body is long and thin. The fingers are long as well, coming to sharp points at the end. Not like claws, just like only continuous pointed digits, if that makes sense. It looked like a skeleton wearing a skin, only much thinner though. Its skin was razor sharp too. Its mouth was full of razor sharp teeth, and its eyes. There are no words in any language on earth that can describe such militia and horror. Already being emotional, I start to lose it. I start to yell at that thing to get off Danny and leave him alone. Everybody probably thinks that I look insane since I'm the only one who can see this thing, but I keep on demanding it goes. Then it looks at me, but I'm so angry that I fight the urge to cower in fear. This time, it just looks at me and it says in that ungodly voice, "Don't get angry, it's all just a game." Then this thing sinks into Danny's chest. He's just absorbed the entity. I'm still working on processing what just happened when I hear a loud metallic snap. It didn't take me long to realise the sound was Danny's right hand restraint buckle, because he suddenly sits up and slowly turns his head until he's staring at me. Once again, his eyes are completely black and his face is scratched into the most horrific smile. There's a tense moment of silence before Danny's mouth opens. In his own voice he says, "Do you want to play a game?" Now before I even get the chance to answer, both the power and candles are extinguished. I feel a gust of wind blow past me and listen as the other members of the party are slammed into the walls and shelves behind us. I'm freaking out by now. I reach for my tiny flashlight that I clipped to my belt loop to avoid being caught without it, and then I realise it was no longer there. How is that even possible? My mind goes into absolute panic as I hear the sound of a metal cap unscrewing and two funks on the hardwood next to Danny's bed. Flashlights are against the rules, I hear Danny say with a giggle. I'm obviously borderline terrified as I squeak out to Father Gabe, "What are we gonna do?" All I hear is him groan out in pain, and suddenly Danny shouts out, "They aren't allowed to play." I'm almost crying now and I ask, "What do you want?" Another giggle, "To play." Then, on come the lights. I'm almost blinded by the sudden exposure of the lights to me. I can't see a thing, but I can hardly believe what I'm seeing. All the males in the group are pinned up against the wall, obviously unable to move. Sarah and I are just staring at each other with the same scared expression. Suddenly, I hear a low growl come out of Danny, bringing our attention back to him. He just isn't smiling anymore. He looks downright evil. He says, "I thought I said lights were against the rules." He snarls, his voice reverting back to the deep growl one. Now from across the house, I hear Danny's grandpa, Laurie, yell and flip that the circuit board just went back on. Danny flies into a rage. He starts thrashing wildly while yelling, "You broke the rules," over and over again. Sarah and I move forward to pin him down and restrain him once again when he suddenly stops flailing. There's a toxic pause before I hear him whisper in a barely audible voice, "Now I'm gonna break something." And then his body starts contorting in the most unnatural way that I've ever seen. He then twisted and twisted, and it put massive amounts of stress and strain onto his left shoulder, as if he were trying to pry himself out of the other restraint. It then clicked to us exactly what he was trying to do. Sarah and I jumped on him, trying desperately to hold him down. I'm not ashamed to say that by this point I started crying. Sarah and I struggled to stop his twisting body from winding any further, but to no avail. I'm 5'7" and 130 pounds. I'm by no means a pushover, and Sarah was only a little smaller than me, but as we were trying our hardest to push him down, we were both crying, and at this point we realised we couldn't do anything. The one thing about all of this that I will never forget the rest of my life, Danny's left shoulder suddenly caves in, retching downwards into the socket with a sickening, unmistakable pop, and just like that, he was back. The thing left him to feel the pain of the shoulder that he'd literally just dislocated. I have never heard another human scream like that. I doubt I ever will. So, this is where I'll stop. I had many stories, but I just wanted to broad stroke the most terrifying and traumatizing of events that took place. I'm not asking anyone to believe me, but I thought that others might find this story interesting. This world is full of both darkness and light. This experience gave me a glimpse of both.
A year ago, me and my husband bought an old house in the northern part of our country. It is an old farmhouse with the previous residents completely redoing it. There is a large piece of land which was used as an agricultural spot for animals and fruit trees. This plot is more and more transformed into a garden by former residents. A part of the garden is a vegetable garden. I love this garden so much. I lived in the city and had no real talent for plants, but last year I learned a lot about growing vegetables, flowers, and herbs. I love to grow my own vegetables. They taste so much better. In front of our house is a road. One side is toward the center of the village and the other to the next village. The road leads through a piece of nature. It is a big old house with a large garden. It has a lot of windows, sunlight, and warm feel to it. I feel really good, peaceful, and comfortable in our new home. It is big because the former stables are drawn into the house. Our bedroom is the upper part of the old stable. There are windows, and the view is great. My husband and I were in love with the house, and I still love it. My husband not so much. He feels watched in the garden, especially at night, and during the day he gets a strange feeling in the garden. In the evening, and sometimes in the daytime, he pulls the curtains closed in the rooms with the windows to the garden. In summer, he does not like to sit in the garden. The terrace in front of our house is okay, but not the second terrace. And the other part of the garden, this is unfortunate, because the terrace has a fireplace. He will go, but he cannot relax. I teased him often and said that he acted like a little child. I feel wonderful in the garden, and I have no problems with it. I never really believed him until he got a new job. This new job asked him that he must travel sometimes and stay in hotels. These nights when I am alone, I always wake up because of the sound of snoring. I open my eyes and there's a creature laying next to me, asleep, snoring. Sometimes with his back to me, sometimes on the back, and sometimes on his stomach. Once he woke up, smiled at me sleepily, and went to sleep. He does not cause me any harm, except wake me up in the morning. He has green skin, black lips, and large pointed ears, and long black hair. Sometimes it is bound and sometimes it is braided, and sometimes stuck together with many golden clips. His hands are like an animal. He dressed in a white shirt and black pants, and his posture was average. The one time he woke up, I saw all black eyes with no whites, and he smiled yellow sharp teeth. I can see this because I always sleep with the lights on when I'm alone. I never like the dark. Normally I fall asleep again because I'm very tired. I feel spooky but no fear. I do not want to tell my husband because I don't want to frighten him, and I'm sure that he will sell the house. I want to know for sure that it's not a dream, but if I tell him, I'm not sure what he'll do. I hope you can help me. I don't want to lose my house.
I live in a high-rise building. Now the building itself is from the 1950s. There's all kind of stories about how this place is supposedly haunted. I never believed any of this. Well, that is until last night. I was having the worst dream ever. I mean, it was horrible. I dreamt that I was asleep in my very apartment. I woke up and there was a face staring at me through the window. As I went to speak to it, it literally come through the window and started attacking me. Just a second before it actually got to me, I woke up. I was drenched in sweat. Now, all of the lights were off in the apartment. Now that didn't make any sense. I would never do that normally. I always make sure I leave at least one on so I can see where I'm going when I wake up. Out of curiosity, I went to look at that window. You know, just how you do sometimes after a dream. Going to check out the stuff you dreamt about. That was when I had the most terrifying experience of my life. As I went towards that window, I could see that there were 2 blobs on the window. I thought that they were just hand marks that I had left there from looking out of it earlier. I went to wipe them off, but nothing. I then got some spray and tried still to wipe them off. That's when I realised that the handprints, they're on the outside of the window, and them hands were way too big to have been mine. Also, did I mention that I'm 50 stories up?
A bit of background first. The following story happened when I was 22 years old, so 6 years ago now. At the time, I was working at a psychiatric facility, doing general admin stuff. The area I worked in organized training programs for frontline staff. It was my first job out of university, and I was hired because I had a mental health related qualification, but the job itself had pretty much nothing to do with that. It was really boring stuff. Lots of copying, filing, and spreadsheeting, etc. I was the youngest person in the office by quite a bit. I think the next youngest was early 30s at the time, and most people were 40 plus. I got along well enough with everyone, but I didn't really have work friends, if that makes any sense. We had flexible working hours, which basically meant that you could come in any time between 6:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. and leave after you'd done your 8 hours or whatever. I was young and quite the night owl, so I usually rocked up at 9:30 a.m. and left at around 5:30 p.m. I was often alone in the office for at least an hour or so at the end of the day, as most of the other staff opted for the start early, leave early approach. The facility where I worked was quite historical. For ease, I'm just going to refer to it as the Center, a collection of heritage-listed buildings, many of which had been repurposed over the years. At the time I was working there, the primary purpose of the center was forensic mental health. So they had high and medium security areas where patients were housed behind secure fences and etc. They also had non-forensic patients and residential rehabilitation units on site. So, this basically meant that a number of patients were free to wander around the place for the most part. Once or twice, we had patients come into our area, but we never had any major trouble from them. The area where I worked didn't have anything to do with patient contact, and our building was on the outskirts of the center, furthest from the high secure area. Our building was a big grassed area out in the back where we were allowed to park, and just to the side of the parking area was an old, dilapidated building that was, probably still is, pretty popular with local ghost hunters. Apparently, they couldn't knock it down because it was heritage listed, but they eventually erected a big fence around it and took the floor in the upper level to deter people from snooping around and hurting themselves. This didn't necessarily stop them though. I remember security being called at least a few times when we noticed people hanging around and trying to sneak in through the fence. The old haunted building had apparently been a ward originally, but had closed sometime after a big flood hit the area over 100 years ago. Now to be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% sure on the accuracy of these details, but from what I was told during the flood, the center was cut off for at least a few days, stranding workers and patients. And during this time, that particular building flooded and a number of patients died. Anyway, regardless of how true the patients dying in the flood story is, the whole place is creepy. It is a historical psychiatric facility after all, and naturally attracts a lot of ghost stories and urban legends. People have of course died over the years, with some standout cases, including a young female patient who was lured off-site by 2 other patients and brutally murdered back in the 80s. So you get the idea, it was an eerie place to work. Our building, like most of the buildings in the center, was heritage listed, and I was told it was originally been a ward for male patients, which they'd repurposed into an office setup. It was divided into 4 wings. The managers had individual offices in one wing, which had apparently originally been solitary confinement rooms. There was an office space next to the manager's wing, which was used occasionally by another service, but they weren't there much, so it was usually locked. Next to that was a main admin wing, where I was working from the time. And finally, the main office wing, where the rest of the non-admin staff worked. Now, to travel between these wings, you had to walk outside, as none of them were connected internally anymore. There were old glass doors connecting the couple of areas, but these had been painted over and repurposed as wall space. As you can imagine, staff weren't immune to the eerie vibe and haunted history of the center, and most everyone who worked there had a strange story, or a few, of strange occurrences and ghostly happenings. I've always had an interest in all things spooky, but in my advanced post-university years, I'd adopted a mildly Scully-esque skepticism toward the paranormal. My interest was still keen, but I was no blind believer. The stories were fun, but after working there for over 6 months, often alone early hours of the evening, I'd never experienced anything, especially ghostly. So, with all of that information in mind, I'll get to my story. On the evening in question, I was the last person left in the office, with everyone else having left by around 5 p.m. It was winter, so it was getting dark fairly early. By 5:30 p.m., it was pretty gloomy. Despite a lack of ghostly happenings during the past 6 months that I had been working at the center, I wasn't immune to the creep factor of being there alone after dark, and I was planning to leave as soon as I'd finished a big load of copying I needed to have done by the next day. I was printing a bunch of training manuals, and every so often I needed to go empty the printing tray, as the printer automatically stopped if there was too much paper stacked up. The industrial printer I was using was stored in a room in the manager's wing, so to go collect the printing I needed to walk outside, down a short ways to the entry door to the manager's wing, then down past some offices to the printing room. The first couple of times I walked down to collect loads of printing, nothing out of the ordinary happened. All of the doors were unlocked, so I just walked out with my wing, down into the manager's wing and into the room with the printer, where the door was open. On the third time I went to collect the printing, however, I was troubled to find the manager's door wing was closed and locked. I fetched my keys and unlocked it and walked inside and up the hall to the printing room, which was strangely locked as well. I unlocked the door, collected the printing, the printer was still going at this stage as well, and went back to my wing, feeling a bit uneasy. I reasoned that perhaps the security had come to check on the building and locked up for the night. This would have been very strange though, as the lights were clearly on in my wing and the printer would have been running, so for them to lock up without checking my area, where it would have been apparent someone was still working, would have been very strange. Strange, but not beyond the realm of possibility, I figured. So I decided I'd stick around till my print job was done, despite feeling a bit creeped out and starting to consider the possibility that perhaps my colleagues' stories of eerie occurrences weren't just watercolor fodder. After waiting a while, I went to collect the next load of printing. I was shaken to find the door of the manager's wing had been once again inexplicably locked. With keys in hand, I unlocked it, walked to the printing room, which was, at this point unsurprisingly, also locked. I unlocked it, grabbed the printing from the tray, and fled back to my wing with considerable haste, leaving both doors wide and open behind me. Back in the comparative comfort of my work area, I once again considered the possible explanations for what was going on. Again, the only thing I could come up with was that the central security had come in locked up. But whilst that was a possibility, albeit unlikely, in the first instance, it was becoming increasingly unlikely, given my subsequent trip to the relocked doors. I really didn't want to go back into the manager's wing again, as by this point, I was truly wigged. By something as innocuous as a couple of locked doors, no less, but despite my rising fear, I needed to grab the final load of printing, and ironically, ensure the wing was locked before I left. I doubted. I was scared of spontaneously locking the door, was going to be viewed as an acceptable excuse if I hightailed it out of there, leaving the printing incomplete and the building possibly unlocked. With the keys in hand, I returned a final time and was initially surprised but relieved to find the door of the manager's wing wide open, just as I had left it during my previous hasty exit. Relaxing a bit, I entered the hallway and walked down to the printing room. However, my heart sank as soon as I saw the door to the room was closed, and sure enough, locked too. I quickly unlocked it, ducked in to grab the printing. However, while I was doing this, I heard a noise from somewhere down the hall. It was a scratching sound, and then sort of a murmur. I ran, slamming the printing door behind me. I rocketed down the hall, and I thought I caught a glimpse of something dark moving down at the end of the corridor. As I ran around the corner and through the outer door, I locked the door quickly, ran back to my wing, dumped the printing on my desk, grabbed my shit, and got the hell out of there. I literally ran to my car. The spontaneous door locking was one thing, but creepy noises, even if it was just my imagination, that was definitely getting a big nope from me. The next day I told a couple of my colleagues about what had happened, and they were sympathetic but ultimately didn't seem terribly surprised or skeptical. It was just a creepy place, and weird things happened there sometimes. After this incident, I tended to come in a bit earlier for a while, so I wouldn't be left there alone at night. Eventually, the fear factor wore off though, and it wasn't too worried about it anymore. There were other occasions during the years that I worked there where strange things would happen. I'd hear voices talking in the next wing to where I was working, even though everyone had left for the day. A few colleagues reported experiencing this too, and odd noises which honestly could have been anything but seemed creepy in context. My uncle worked in the center too for a time, and he recounted how he and a colleague once had been working late at another building on site when they had suddenly heard what sounded like a waterfall roaring down the halls in the room. He said it went for several minutes, and it was deafening, before suddenly just stopping. He never could explain what caused the sound. If I had to put my skeptic hat on, looking back at my printing room experience, I feel like the sounds I heard, the scratching and the murmur, were definitely real, but I'll accept I could have misidentified the sound of something mundane as something more sinister in my already heightened emotional state. I was pretty terrified by that point. To be honest, I probably didn't actually see anything. I suspect it was just likely my fear clouding my judgment and subsequently coloring my memory of the incident. The locked doors, however, 100% legitimate and fairly inexplicable in my opinion. As I said, it was a pretty creepy place. I almost missed working there.
It's almost 5 in the morning right now. I am wide awake. It's the most wide awake I've ever been. I'm an atheist and don't believe in any of this, but what I saw has truly grabbed my attention and chilled me to the bone. I was having a completely random dream. I then woke up, staring at my sliding closet door. The moment I woke up, the closet door slid open, as quietly and smoothly as it possibly could. I jumped out of bed and yelled, "Hey!" turned the lights on. Nothing. I turned on the lights throughout my apartment. My doors are locked. Everything is normal. I then looked in the closet and there was nothing. I slid the doors open to see if it was a gust of wind, but nothing of the sort was there. It actually made some creaking sounds when I opened it and closed it. How on earth could it have possibly slid open the way it did without making any sound? The other thing that doesn't make sense is my bedroom's at a slight angle. It was literally defying gravity to open the way it did.
During my senior year of high school, I would normally sleep real late into the night. Since my room was on the second floor, it provided me with the privacy I needed, without anyone disturbing my conversations. I was a teenager who enjoyed talking on the phone with friends, and calling from bed was the perfect time to gossip. My younger brother at the time slept upstairs as well, but he slept in the room next to mine. On one particular weekend night, which has haunted me to this day, I was in bed talking on the phone with a friend. Everyone in the household was sleeping since it was late into the night. There was enough moonlight coming into my room that I could make out the outlines of the objects that were in my room. My bed at the time was in the corner of one of the walls, while the door was at the right of my bed. I was resting my eyes for a while during my phone conversation when I had an uneasy feeling. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow standing next to my bed. Even with the moonlight, the shadow was dark, and I could not make out any features. I just stood there, while I felt my body freeze in horror, my gut told me that this was a malevolent entity. After staring at this figure for what seemed like an eternity, the entity shifted into a shape. I saw it transform a two-legged shadow to a four-legged creature with a tail. When it did this, it crawled on my ceiling near my bed. My room ceiling is low due to the shape of the roof. There is a slant to the ceiling on the edge, so you can hit your head on it if you're not careful. It is at this moment that I threw my phone. My friend was still on the line, jumped out of bed, and went for the light switch next to the door. I did not look back at the creature out of fear. When I turned on the light, it turned off in a matter of seconds. I turned it back on again, and it turned off again. I felt my adrenaline going after I failed to keep the light on, so I threw open my door, turned on the light in the hallway, and frantically knocked on my brother's door. I woke up my brother that night, and although angry as soon as he opened the door, he looked concerned when he saw me crying and shaking terribly. I told him what had happened and what I'd seen in my room, and I quickly tailed him behind in to check my room and retrieve my phone. When he turned on the light from my room, the light stayed on. We did not find anything but my phone still on the bed. Apparently my friend had tried to call me several times after that, but I cut our conversation short due to what I had seen. My brother believed me, probably from the way I was acting and looking, and he wanted to tell my parents, then and there. It was pretty late in the night and I didn't want to wake them. I also knew they were not going to believe me because they are hardcore skeptics. I realized that they were just going to dismiss it as a dream, and I told my brother not to say anything, and I ended up staying in my brother's room that night. I could not sleep at all that night due to the fear and due to the questioning of exactly what that thing was.
Hello everyone, this is a story from my grandmother from when she was younger in the late 60s. She and her friends decided to use an Ouija board to try and talk with spirits. They're all non-believers. So they got ready and all three of them put their hands on the move-in thing. They then asked, "Who's there?" And the piece then started moving. Then my grandmother said that she let go and told her friend, "Hey, stop moving it, it's so obvious." And her friend said, "I'm not moving it, you are." And they tried again. This time, they asked it, "Who's there?" And the same thing happened. My grandma told me that she felt terrified. She said she really didn't know what to believe now, and instead of a name, the board spelled out a phone number, and my grandma was freaked out. None of them dared to call it. They asked, "Whose number is this?" Then it started to move once again, and this time it spelled out, "Call this number and tell Joseph not to travel tomorrow." My grandmother and her friends were horrified by this because none of them knew a Joseph, so they tried calling the number, no answer. Again, no answer. So they all decided to go home and call it a night. None of them called, but my grandma did the next morning at around 8 AM. She called and there was a woman. My grandma said, "Hello, can I speak to Joseph?" And the woman said, "He's not here right now, he went to work. Who is this?" My grandma explained the situation and the woman said, "Oh my god, I'll call you back when I've told him." The next day, the woman called up again and was crying. Her husband Joseph died on the way to his work in a car accident that sent him plummeting off a bridge into a river. My grandmother was deeply saddened by hearing this. She vowed never to use an Ouija board again. I got a story that I rarely tell because of how much it scares me. At the time, I was 18, just graduated high school. I didn't go college right away. I took a break and picked up a second job instead. For my second job, I worked third shift, that's 10 PM to 5 AM, with 4 other people on a rotated schedule. That's no more than 3 a night and sometimes 2 a night. After a few months, I become friends with my co-workers. We'd take smoke breaks and eat lunch in the back room, playing music, etc. Honestly, it was a really chill job. I actually really enjoyed it. Working at night can mess up your brain, I realised that. However, My body completely adapted, and I always felt energetic and ready to go to every shift. At this point, I should probably say that when we worked, all the doors were locked and there's absolutely no way to get in or out without triggering the nightly alarm. So on one particular night, we showed up just before the manager left for the night and locked up. He then told us that it would only be my co-worker, who I'll call Mike, and I, as our schedule. Jake, as I'll call him, called in sick about an hour ago. Me and Mike had no problem. I was probably closest to him because he was my age and he had my dad as a teacher at his school. We start our usual routine with walking around the store with my manager to ensure nobody else is there. We have to then go and check every single door and watch him alarm the doors on his way out. We decided the first order of business was to smoke a cigarette in the back of the warehouse. We never had a problem with accidentally setting it off because it was so high up. Here's where things get wild. Now stay with me. Me and Mike pulled a pallet stacked with boxes out from the warehouse and onto the main floor. I grabbed a dolly with some boxes of dried goods and headed to a different aisle so we could be ahead of schedule. We always typically split up for efficiency. About 15 minutes pass and I head back to take more boxes. The pallet was in a central point in between us. Neither of us were in the same aisle as it was. When I got there, I saw a bag of chips and dip opened up on the pallet with obvious dip marks. We would often eat from this and just leave cash at the front of the cashier so that way they could go and sort this out in the morning. Our manager was fine with it. Mike met me at the pallet and I was loading up on my second trip. I then started making fun of Mike for grabbing them because it just seemed like a really weird thing to grab. He then looked into my eyes with this deadly serious look. His face had now changed. No, that's yours. Apparently my face did the same when I told him that it wasn't mine either. Obviously Jake was pulling a prank on us or something and the manager went along with it, right? No. At this point we both decided to be logical and check the store to catch whoever was doing this. We both have goosebumps the size of mosquito bites on our arm and we just try and laugh it off. But obviously something was wrong. Way wrong. It just seemed a little colder and we both were on edge. We sweep the warehouse in the back and the break room, etc. No dice. We're now getting closer to the front of the store. There's only one entrance to the store. It's right near all the 12 registers we had. Now in the front, there's this big metal rack. That's where we sold the charcoal for the grills and also those big logs that burn really slowly. As we walk inside of it, we hear a loud sound and 3 logs suddenly fly off the shelf. I'm not gonna lie, I screamed and it made Mike jump. We're freaking out at this point, but I stopped and convinced him to walk to the shelf with me so that way we could check it out. With 2 adults, each over 170 pounds, we realised that we couldn't even budget. Someone, or something, obviously threw it off with great force in front of our faces. We walk around the store again trying to figure out who or what was causing this, any excuse to blame this on, and we find nothing. We then decide the best thing to do is continue work and listen to loud music. We work together for the rest of the night. Here's the craziest part. We're getting done a little early, so at 4:50, about 10 minutes earlier than we should have, and we started goofing off on those electric scooters for the handicapped people that are in front. It's critical I tell you this next part. The front had big glass windows, so that way you can see both in and out from the parking lot. We kinda just didn't talk about what we saw after it happened. I went to sleep that day and woke up to a call from Jake. He was practically having a panic attack. His mum, who worked there during the day, was one of the ones who come in at 5. She was older. Jake told me that just as we clocked out, he started talking to her and she said, "Who was that by the door?" It kind of looked like a person, but it was more like a black mist, just in front of you guys on the scooter. My grandfather was a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot during World War II. His plane was brought down a number of times during the war. One of those times he experienced something he could never explain. His plane was shot down in Germany. It was a hazy evening and hard to see a whole lot. There was a group earlier that had been bombing the area. He and another plane went down in the forest. The other pilot did not survive. My grandfather was trying to find somewhere that he could hide at while the German planes were still in the air. He then heard somebody crying. He understood that most casualties of war were innocent civilians, so he was trying to find out who was crying to see if he could help them. It was getting very dark out when he found a little girl with cuts on her face and covered in dirt and ash. He didn't speak German very well, but he knew enough to figure out what she was saying. He followed her through the trees for a while. He couldn't see very much because there was a lot of ash in the air. Everything smelt burnt and dead. He always said that's what everything smelt like during the war. Burnt, dead, sometimes mouldy. They then came out to what was left of a small farm in a forest. They were very near a small town, the one that had been bombed. A bomb hit the farm directly and everything was broken and collapsing. The girl then led him to the front door, which was half broken off, and they went inside. As he went inside, he couldn't find the little girl anymore. She was gone. He was very afraid because he had literally nowhere to go. It was the middle of night, so he had to stay hidden in the house until morning. In the morning, he then discovered that there were several bodies around the farm. There was a man, a woman, and 3 young girls. One of the girls looked exactly like the one who'd led him into the house. She had been crushed by a piece of wall. He buried the bodies and then went back to his plane to see if he could radio for help. I was only around 12 years old when this happened. Me, my mum, along with my brother went to our local cemetery to say some prayers for the dead. We're Catholic. Now I'm not sure why we did this, but I think it was because our family friend had just died and got buried there. We prayed here for about 30 minutes and then decided to leave. My mum got in the truck with me and my brother was about to get in the passenger side, which is also at the side facing the graveyards. Right as my mum got in and shut the door, a random, unusually strong gust of wind started blowing in the direction of the graveyard. We then all suddenly heard the most horrific, disembodied scream that any of us have ever heard in our lives. I vividly remember it sounded like it was an older woman who was maybe in her 40s or 50s, I guess. After I looked over at my brother, he looked straight back at me with the same pale expression on my face. After that, we all jumped into the truck and frantically told our mum what had just happened, and she just responded saying, yeah, okay. I know without doubt it was a paranormal experience that happened to me because there were no houses around the cemetery and there was no way that anybody's voice could have been carried that far. I mean, literally, nobody was there. It wasn't just the fact that nobody was around though, it's the fact that you could hear it projected at us and it was so close to us, yet nobody was there. My brother and I still talk about it to this day 10 years later. And this was literally the most screwed up scream that I've ever heard in my life. If I had to say, it would almost sound demonic. This is a true story that happened to my father about 13 years ago. That day, my dad was so excited to be taking a shop class at a community college. The catch was that he had to travel over a mountain to attend it. He asked to borrow my sister's car so that way he could attend the seminar for the weekend. He headed off early that winter morning, full of joy, excited for what was ahead. Unfortunately, at 10 AM, I got a call saying that my father was being rushed to hospital. He was in critical condition and was rushed into emergency surgery. A part of his bone was coming out of his leg. He had collapsed lungs and other major injuries. It was touch and go for 4 weeks while he was trying to heal. During this time we had the car towed to the local car impound yard. I went with my mother to clear out the car and met the insurance adjuster. As we began clearing out the car, I realised that the back window was completely shattered and the front driver's seatbelt appeared to be cut. It was almost as if somebody had come along and cut the seatbelt and whatnot where the driver sat. I made sure that I double checked to see if there was any fraud edges, but there were none. I knew my sister at that time never kept a seatbelt cutter, and I couldn't find any scissors in the car. Now the hospital told us that the emergency crew had found my father laying in the snow, which had sent him into hypothermia, and this had probably saved his life from internal bleeding. It appeared that my father had a stroke. He either had the stroke which caused him to go off the cliff, or he'd fallen asleep at the wheel because of it. They say if he had not flown out of the back window, his injuries could have been twice as bad, and he would probably be dead on impact. We got a copy of the police report of the incident. The report states that a man had flagged down a passing car for help. The driver in the vehicle saw the man and saw the tyres tracks going over the edge of the cliff. He decided to stop and see what was wrong and see if he could assist the man with anything. He followed this man and looked down the cliff and found my father laying in a pool of blood. The car had been rolled and stopped by a boulder 250 feet down. If it hadn't stopped him, he would have went another 250 feet down into the river. Now my father had flown out of the back window during the accident and landed in the snow. The man who had been flagged down offered to stay to help my dad, while the other guy ran down to get the mountain rescue team for help. When the emergency crew got there, he was still staying with my father and showed them where my father was. They immediately attended my father. Then, thinking the man was a part of the accident, they went to find him to treat him as well, but he was nowhere to be found. They looked all around and said the only footprints they could see were the ones of the emergency personnel that they made down the cliffside. They all gave a description of the man that was staying with my father in the report. The description was very odd to me. Months later, my father was finally able to come home into home care. I decided to ask my father if he remembered the accident. He said that he remembers most of it, but not the hospital. I asked him if he had cut the seatbelt with whatever he had around him. He said that he never cut the seatbelt but had flown out of the window during the accident. He said he tried to call for help but had no service. My father then told me that he also said his best friend, and who was also his uncle, was with him through the entire accident, from just before he went off the cliff until he saw emergency personnel. He sat with him, comforting him as he went in and out of consciousness. The description on the police report also matches my great uncle's description. I remember growing up spending many days at his family house during the summers. My father and uncle were very close. Farrell unfortunately passed away a year earlier from the time of my father's accident of brain cancer. My father was devastated when it happened. Now, not only did seeing his old friend at the accident help him survive, but it also helped my father get over the loss of his best friend. Ever since my grandpa died, which was back in 2004, the same type of bird has often been following us into places where we like to go or lived. Now, I'm no bird expert, but it's always pretty small and it has an orange breast. When it appears, it just looks curiously like it's just observing. It would actually get quite close to us and never even seem scared. But it would never eat anything that we left for it. A lot of the time that we would see it, it would be in his grave in the cemetery. But not always. Sometimes it comes after rethinking memories of my grandpa. I mean, like even yesterday, me, my mum and grandma were walking through the forest and picking up some berries and mushrooms like we normally do. Suddenly, this bird was next to us. It observed us for a moment and then simply flew away. My mum then told me that going through the forest and picking berries was one of my grandpa's favourite things to do. I used to live in a house that backs up to a big open space where there are lots of hiking trails. Lots of joggers and people walk their dogs there. Anyway, one night, I had a kind of creepy dream that there was an old lady that come into my room and she kept on trying to get me to go outside with her. The dream woke me up, so I gone and got some water from the tap and turned off my fan because it was really cold when I fell asleep again. I then went right back into the same dream with the same old lady trying to come into my room and saying, "You have to go outside now." I kept telling her that it was too cold. I woke up again. This time, my fan was on. I figured I must have just turned it on or accidentally flipped the switch as I got up, so I turned the fan off and went back to sleep. This time, I had the exact same dream again, except she was much older looking and this one really agitated. She was yelling at me, "Go outside, you must go outside." I got up in the dream and followed her to the hallway. When I got to the hallway, she wasn't there, and I woke up and I was actually standing in the middle of the hallway. I have never walked around in my sleep before or after this. Also, my fan was on again when I come back to my room. At this point, I was freaked out, so I gone and got something to eat and watched TV. I went back to bed at around 5 or 6 and the dream never came back. The really messed up part to all of this is that, a couple of days later, I saw that there were police cars in the open space, and when I asked my mum what was happening, she said that they found an older woman who was reported missing days ago, and she must have had a heart attack or stroke or something by the trail and actually died there. This took place in 2008 in northern Ohio. My cousins invite me out to go on a camping trip to some hidden state park or whatever. I just happily agreed because hey, Ohio has to be the best part of Indiana, right? I then drive over to the houses and we pack our tent and get some food and headed out in his truck for a few hours. After miles of twists and turns in the road, it finally gets really bumpy enough to wake me up, and we're suddenly off the grid like a dirt road track, if that makes sense. We then park off our truck and head into the hills for a couple of miles. We make our base camp at the top of a hill overlooking a valley with thick trees and whatnot on either side of us. Eventually at nightfall at around 1 AM, we head towards a fire. As we're sat there, I ask what the park's called, and they all just laugh at me. No, this isn't a park, it's native land that we're camping upon, and this is a sacred hill. I thought they were lying, but they name a tribe which sounded like it was pretty legit, and I couldn't really argue against them. A few minutes later, we hear this screamy howl that just kind of drifts across the hills and right towards where we are. We all grew up hunting, and we've been around the country and have had a fair share of animal encounters and howls, and none of us knew what this was. If anything, I would say a screaming fox, but it was too deep for that. Maybe like a wolf would carry, I don't know. We were still laughing at it and to be honest found it really funny. But eventually when it continued and it was obviously getting closer to us, we started to get very uneasy. The fifth scream sounded like it was coming from down the valley, so we all looked over into the direction, and I don't care if you believe this or not, but I say this is true to my death. Out of the tree line, I saw what looked like a gnarly thin naked man who was far away, and he seemed way too tall to be normal. He was somewhat transparent. This thing takes off in a sprint with both its legs coming directly towards us with no hesitation. All three of us ran out of the hill and into the woods towards the car. Being nigh at it only made it more terrifying. As we reach the bottom of the hill, we hear the screaming again. This time it is where our camp is. None of us turn back to even check if the thing's near us. After the fastest 2-mile hike in my life, we finally get to the truck and floor it off the land to the nearest McDonald's, where we all sat down with no words together. We agreed to go back in the morning to grab our things. We do, and to our surprise, nothing has been moved and nothing seems out of the ordinary. We expected the place to be trashed, or at least a few things to be taken. We then drove to my uncle's and we tried to joke about it and move on, but this has bothered me till this very day. I don't think it's something that I'm ever going to forget. I just remembered this today. About a year ago, when my mum and I were driving around, we approached a red light and the car in front of us started slowing down totally normally. This car had actually been in front of us for about 10 minutes. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the light turned green and the car didn't move. We waited here about a minute before my mum decided to beep at him to try and get this guy to move. But he still didn't move. There was no response. Now we couldn't see the back of their head, so we figured they'd just dropped something. The light turned red again, and at this point my mum beeped again out of annoyance, which probably isn't the best thing to do. A pedestrian starts walking across and had seen the whole thing. He decides to knock on the car window to make sure the person inside is okay. My mum and I watch as there's no response. He looks in the car, then looks at us with a really confused expression. He starts shaking his head while looking at us again. He does the same thing twice. I lower my window and ask if the person is okay. He then replies with, There's nobody inside. Way back when my mother was only a baby and my uncle was 4 years old, my grandmother invited some friends round while their husbands went out to drink at the pub. They had a nice house in the mountains, so it wasn't often that people ventured up there unless it was their intention to visit. After the men had left, the woman decided to do an Ouija board. My grandmother had already put my mother to sleep, and as the only other person in the house was my uncle who was playing in the kitchen with them, they all put their finger on the playset and asked the generic questions. Is anyone with us, etc. After a few minutes of trying to get it to move, it eventually went to yes. My grandmother was a little uncomfortable with this, but they carried on anyway. They decided to ask how the person had died. The Ouija board spelled out, "cannot tell you." They asked who it was and it said the same again. This confused them. My grandmother asked why not, and it wouldn't tell them anything. The only answers that they can really get are weird ones like, "There are too many ears." My grandmother tells me that this surprised them and that they weren't sure if they wanted to carry on. That's when the thing began to move again, and it tells them, "Send the boy out of the room." Now this is my uncle. My grandmother is ashamed that she actually sent him into a different room. The board then starts spelling something else but suddenly stops and spells out, "Somebody is coming." And they hurriedly said goodbye. It turns out that my grandfather had forgotten his wallet and driven back to the house. My grandmother looks back on this and tells me how that she's glad they're interrupted. She tells me she hates to think what could have possibly happened to my uncle had he have actually been left there alone and the session hadn't stopped. This happened about a month ago. I was in my room when I heard this loud crash coming from the doorway of my home. I went out there to see what was going on, and I could see that an angel sculpture had fallen onto the ground. The thing is that this sculpture's string was placed on a metal hook. The only way for it to be taken down is by somebody pulling on the string and holding it up over the hook. There's no way that it would just fall down. The string hadn't broken either. I decided that I was going to take some pictures of this, and as I opened up my iPhone, I saw that my storage space was 6.66. Now, I know this could all have been some weird coincidence, but it still doesn't explain how the angel fell, and why was it the angel of all the sculptures that fallen? About 20 years ago, my great-grandmother passed when I was in my early teens. We didn't live in the same state as her, so unfortunately we missed her funeral, but we were able to drive 2,000 miles to visit the rest of the family a couple of weeks later. Now I'm from a Catholic family, so it was no surprise that she had the typical religious candles and statues of many saints. Among the things, there was a blonde doll in a blue dress in a giant glass cabinet. We were told by my aunt that the doll would grow hair, and apparently they regularly took care of it, bathing it, washing its clothes and trimming its hair. They also were convinced that there was a spirit living inside it. Coincidentally, my mum was familiar with that doll and tried to convince me that the doll's hair had grown. I wasn't buying it. I paid close attention to the length of its hair, because my family refused to let me take pictures. Now the hair flowed a little past the shoulders, nothing spectacular, it just looked like a regular doll. A couple of years later, my grandmother wanted to revisit our out-of-state family members, so what was the first thing I wanted to do? Yeah, go and check on the doll. Now its hair had grown outwards towards the entire length of the doll. I talked with my family and they said the doll was grey-stricken due to the passing of my great-grandmother, and that they actually saw some tears down her face the next couple of days. They explained that they had stopped cutting the hair because apparently that was my great-grandmother's thing. I hadn't seen the rest of my family since, but we hear from them once in a while, and the doll is still with them, and amazingly, the hair is still growing and everything. I never got a real explanation as to why this was happening, just that there was a spirit inside the doll. I was staying with a friend in a remote house in Scotland. It was midnight and I woke up to go to the toilet, and suddenly it was very, very cold, and I heard somebody complain, "They always make this room so filthy, always. I'm always cleaning this, it's so dirty all the time, I can't stand it." It was freezing cold while I was hearing this, and suddenly, as soon as the talking stopped, it became warm again. The next morning, I told the house owner what happened last night and how it was suddenly very cold, and I couldn't finish my sentence before he said, "Who have you seen?" Now that part where he said who sent shivers down my spine. What do you mean who? He later told me his daughter and son-in-law lived in that very room, and the son-in-law had died in an accident, and he loved to keep the room spotless. I was a complete skeptic before this incident. My wife and I rented a secluded small 2-bedroom cabin in the Washington area so that way we could have a hiking adventure. Upon arriving, my wife walked into the house and said that there was no way she was sleeping in one of the rooms because of the energy. To her defense, it was a bit creepy. There was a weird doll dress that was on the walls of decoration. There was a weird rocking chair that seemed to move on its own, and there was also some door that seemed to lead into an attic. Once we got settled, we discovered a journal with entries from past guests. There were multiple terrifying entries. My husband woke up to the smell of bacon and eggs cooking, yet nobody was awake. I wouldn't mind that, to be honest. The doll dress in the bedroom is the gateway to hell. We woke up last night to the sound of something walking in the attic, yet the door was locked, and when we come to find it the following morning, it was open. I didn't think any of this was real, but we decided to sleep in the living room now. So the next night, after hiking all day, we were eating and drinking outside at night by the fire. We were drinking some alcohol, and I started to dare my wife to go into the bedroom that she was scared about. She was freaked out, but I insisted there was nothing wrong with the house, and I proceeded to go inside and take the challenge myself by exploring the room at night. As I entered the hallway, I reached the door and turned the doorknob and pushed the handle inwards to enter the room. Now the door opened about 10 inches and stopped, as it hit a chair that was propped up against the door. My mind quickly calculated the logics of why this had happened. Door opens inward, room with only one entrance, chairs at the side of the door keeping me from going in. I then let out my scream and slammed the door shut after I realised what was happening and played it off to my wife that I was trying to scare her. So it's about 5:30 AM. I went to bed about 15 minutes prior. I'm still not fully asleep. I can still hear CNN in the background on my TV. Then, I see a huge black force sprinting towards me from about 10 meters away. Instantly, I screamed so loud and ran out of my room. I was so scared I didn't really have any time to think. Imagine just laying there with your eyes closed, suddenly feeling like somebody's watching you, opening them, and somebody's running at you silently like they're on their tiptoes. Now the thing is, I haven't seen that thing since. I know whatever it was, it just felt really evil. I know that if I'd stayed there any longer, I would have been in great danger. And that's not the worst thing. This happened again. A friend of mine, Jen, is a semi-retired geriatrics nurse with a Masters of Science in Nursing. She is in her mid-60s and has experienced numerous unexplainable events in her career, and I have one story to share. Jan was a head nurse during one stage of her life at a nursing home where one of her male patients was in the process of dying. He had an abundance of family members visiting him near the end, and Jan would occasionally drop in to speak with the family and try and assure them on his condition. During one visit to his room, Jan was standing around talking with his relatives when the patient sat up in the bed and exclaimed, "Dorothy, what are you doing here?" while staring directly at an empty corner of the room. Lots of the family members there were very emotional by this, and they started crying. Some of them were just dumbfounded though. Jen asked why the reactions. One of the patient's family members then stated that Dorothy was a patient's sister. She passed away within the last 24 hours and they didn't want to upset him by telling him that his sister had died. Even reciting this story now still sends shivers up my spine. The following took place 5 years ago, when me and some friends got bored one night and decided to go and explore a church. Now this church was supposedly haunted, but that was nothing compared to what was meant to happen in the graveyard. Apparently if you stood there at certain nights you would hear voices that seemed to swirl around you, and you would have the immediate urge to leave. Me and my friends couldn't pass up on how interesting this could be for us, so we all decided to go there one wintry night. If I'm completely honest, I was really skeptical going there. I knew this place would be creepy and your mind would play tricks on you, but nothing was actually going to happen. Definitely not the swirling sounds. So anyway, as we get there, like I thought, nothing really happened. I got bored and my friends actually started trying to provoke ghosts. They did this for some time but nothing really seemed to happen, so we decided to go back to the car. Just as we did so, this intense sudden storm really picked up. That was a little scary to be honest. I mean the others were laughing about it with me, but I think if we're true to ourselves it did creep us out, because the weather was pretty calm up until then and I didn't see any clouds until that point in the dark night sky. So we all make our way back to the car laughing and joking around about what we had heard. Nothing. Just as we're doing so, we hear this really loud crash sound like somebody smashed a piece of glass. We then turn around and see that all of the statues of angels have suddenly tipped over. I mean literally every single one. There was like 20 statues which we could see. 8 of them were angels and every single one was on its side now. I really wish I could tell you more about this story or a follow-up, but honestly, I have no idea what happened that night. None of us do. We all got out of there and we've never discussed it since.